Hey guys, so I wanted to talk about a paper that I just read. It's a ethics and technology paper. It's called "On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots: Can Language Models Be Too Big?" It was published in March of 2021, and the authors are Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, Angelina McMillan Major, and this is interesting, Schmargit Schmitchell. I'll explain that in a bit. So this paper kind of came to my attention because recently I was seeing some interviews of two of the authors of this paper, Timnit Gebru, which I'm pretty sure I'm probably messing up her name, even though I've heard it pronounced several times, and Emily Bender. And there was a controversy around this paper because basically it led to Dr. Gebru being fired from a job at Google. So I don't want to get too much into that controversy because there's a lot of videos online about that. And actually, Vice News interviewed Dr. Gebru, so that they did a better job than I can ever do with that because they went to the original source. I want to talk about the paper, but I'll give a little background. So she was fired. Dr. Gebru was fired December of 2020 from the ethical artificial intelligence team. And by the way, if you can probably see in my glasses, I'm looking at notes and not a script. So I'll try to make this concise as possible and try not to stutter too much over words, but I'm not looking at a script, so there you go. So basically, Google asked her to either withdraw the paper or to remove her name from the paper, and she was willing to do that. She said in an interview, "Yeah, I'll do it, but I want to know why do you want me to do this?" She wanted to know kind of the inner workings of what led to that decision. And what they did is they just fired her. Now, they claim that she resigned, and she says that she was fired. And quite honestly, after listening to the interview, well, let's put it this way: she resigned when she was on vacation. When you look at the details, it looks like they fired her. So their claim was, let's see here, that the paper didn't have adequate research. That was their claim from it. So, okay. So one of the other authors of the paper worked for Google was another ethical, I guess another ethical IE co-lead, Margaret Mitchell, and she was fired too. She was fired for, let's see here, for moving electronic files outside of the company. And her reason for doing that was, quote, to raise concerns about race and gender inequality and to speak up about Google's problematic firing of Dr. Gebru. Well, guess what? She got the boot. But she did, by their request, remove her name from the paper, technically. So the Schmargit Schmitchell, that's actually Margaret Mitchell, who worked at Google. I was a bit confused by that because at first I thought maybe they were making some funny reference to the author of Gone with the Wind. So go figure. But anyway, so what is the paper actually talking about? Because like I said, I don't want to get too much into the controversy. What is the paper actually talking about? So I'll say that the paper, it's a critique of language models, and this is referenced in the actual title of the paper. So the term in the title of the paper is stochastic parrots, and what does that mean? Well, basically it comes from the idea that when you have these language models, what they do is, even though they seem like you're having a conversation with an intelligent machine, all it does is it basically looks at all the words and it forms a sentence by what would be the statistically most likely word to follow, right? So if you were to say to a machine, hello, and it says hello, well, what would follow that? Maybe, how are you? And this gives a semblance of a thinking machine, but all it is basically saying it reads tons and tons of data, because to get in this, we kind of understand just the basic. We need to have a basic understanding of how these models work. So basically, what it does is it looks at tons and tons of written text, right? So it looks at tons and tons of written text, and then from those tons and tons of written text, it follows an example of how you construct sentences. Okay, so that's how the language models work. So this paper is critiquing that process of creating these language models, and the critique can basically be put into two categories, or two critiques, or at least I'm putting it into two categories: the environmental critique and the social critique. And even within trying to put it into the environmental critique and the social critique, the two are intertwined. So it's first talking about the environmental critique. So once again, when they're creating these models, they have huge bits of text, and it's reading through all this text, and it basically kind of, and I'll say in quotes, learns how to imitate speech by looking at tons and tons of text. Okay? So the environmental cost of that is that it takes up a lot of energy. It takes up a lot of processing power, and it takes up a lot of storage power. So the example that they cite in in the paper, maybe not the example, but how they explain it, is that they say that a training model, it takes about the same amount of energy as a transatlantic flight. And then they make the claim that the majority of the energy that is being used to create these models, they're not coming from the renewable resources. So one thing they say is, and they make suggestions, they critique, and then they make a suggestion. And one of the suggestions they make is that maybe when they're considering the energy, they need to consider the energy preference trade-offs. Like, where does the energy come from? And even though it may cost a little more, maybe you should try to use more renewable sources of energy. Right? So, like a lot of environmental issues tied to global warming and energy consumption, poor countries are disproportionately affected by this. So think of the flooding in Pakistan, which the flooding in Pakistan and the droughts in the Sudan. But then on top of that, because these language models are learning from reading text, and most of the text, which I'll get into in a little bit, are in English, they don't even benefit as much from it because, well, if you're not an Anglophone country, you're not going to benefit as much from it. So this kind of leads to the social costs. So what are some of the social costs? Well, first, there's a bias that comes with it. Where is the data coming from? So a common source of the data is Common Crawl. And Common Crawl is this huge database that consists of petabytes of data that's been collected over 8 years. Well, when you look at Common Crawl, and Common Crawl is referencing a term called crawl, which is a process of collecting data. I don't want to get too much in that, but let's just say that it's a huge database of open source text. So just think of books that are public domain, conversations, whatever, right? So 40% of this data, or 40% of the Common Crawl text, is in English. And then the next languages, the most common languages, are Russian, German, Chinese, Japanese, French, and Spanish. And each of those make up less than 6% of the data being used. So it's already disproportionately benefiting English speakers, Anglophone countries, but it's affecting, through the energy use, these non-English speaking parts of the world. And also, if you think about if you ask one of these technologies to write a paper, which is a concern nowadays, it's going to be skewed toward the Anglophone point of view. An interesting thing is Dr. Gibru, she is Ethiopian, so she's tried to conversate with some of these texts, and I believe it's Tigrian, and she said it's terrible. So in English, it can fairly well imitate human speech, but when you go to other languages, especially ones that aren't well represented, or barely represented, it just looks like jabber, just mush. So another example is Reddit. So they may use Reddit threads to get a lot of their information or their examples of text. So 67% of Reddit users are men, and 64% of Reddit users are between the ages of 19 and 29. So there, you're going to skew the way it's written, the information that's presented by these language models towards men. And then there's the problem of ageism or bias that may form from basically sampling a disproportionate number of people from these age categories. So what about Wikipedia, which is a huge source of data? And of course, we can look at Wikipedia and we can say, well, we notice that English is the greatest represented language in Wikipedia, and you can see how other languages that aren't very well represented in Wikipedia. But another thing that we can measure here is that when it comes to people who actually write articles for Wikipedia, the estimate is that only 8.8 to 15% of them are women. So for example, the language that goes into talking about conversations and like sexual assault, they notice that words such as words like tantrum comes up. So that, for example, women are reporting issues of sexual assault or conversations about sexual assault, and the people who are writing this, being disproportionately men, may use words like a woman is having a tantrum. It's not exactly what the paper says, but that's more or less what a paper says, and you have a bias with the language being used. Now remember, these models aren't sexist. They don't have emotions and they don't have opinions because it's just a machine, but it'll come off that way in the language that's being used because they're learning from sexist biased people. So then, well, they try to remedy this with one thing. So they have a GPT-2 learning model, and they're like, well, we can improve this. So they have the GPT-3 model. So what they decided to do is we're going to use the same data from Common Crawl that we got from the GPT-2 model, but we're going to remove references to these 400 naughty words, right? And there's still a problem with that because, well, what ends up happening there is that, well, you remove these words, but it ends up maybe even disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. So the example they give is the use of the word twink, twink referring to the slang for certain gay men. And apparently in these forums of the queer community, they use the word twink and not in a necessarily a derogatory term or a derogatory manner, but they end up getting edited out and maybe even be disproportionately edited out. And the example that comes in my mind is that if I go on Black Twitter, there's going to be words that black folk use more, that not in that derogatory sense, but it's going to be edited out. So you end up being in the hopes of basically helping a situation, they may actually make it worse by marginalizing or limiting the voices of marginalized groups even more. So another example I give is how when it looks at, let's say, the open text of news, how it won't I say this, the way they say it is like it won't, certain social movements will be either misrepresented or underreported. So an example they give is the Black Lives Matter protests that were taking place after the death of George Floyd. So kind of looking this up, how a peaceful protest versus a violent protest, and how that may be misreported by these language models. So here an explanation for that. So looking this up, the Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project, which they're a nonprofit organization that collected data, the ACLED. What they did is they looked at 7,750 Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 50 states and in Washington, D.C., and found out that 93% of them were nonviolent. Now, if you watch the news, obviously when you have conservative news like Fox News or Newsmax, they are going to skew their news, and they're going to present these protests as being, or they did show these protests as being inherently violent and problematic. But even this comes up in CNN and MSNBC, the less, I guess you could say, not necessarily left-wing news, but more centrist news stations. And they disproportionately report the violent protests because, and it may not be intention, but it's just that blood sells. So the peaceful protests, the 93% of the peaceful protests were underreported. They didn't make the news. So these language models, they are, when they're reading this, they're being skewed by that information. And some other things, such as how it's biased against disabled people, for example, people with mental health issues. Just the term mental health may be disproportionately associated with gun violence. One last example would the language models don't understand context. So even if you ask the language model to write a report on something like immigration, the language model may use the term illegal versus undocumented because the language model does not know the context of illegal versus undocumented, because all it sees maybe from its text is the use of the term illegal referring to immigrants who versus undocumented. So two terms that mean the same but have a different context. Language models don't know the context. Okay. So reading this paper, I didn't really find it particularly controversial. It seems to me that it's controversial if you're invested in maintaining a particular status quo, and that these companies, namely Google, don't want to be held accountable. So removed from the controversy of Dr. Guru being fired, I think the paper is worth reading. The beginning of the paper, it does start talking about various language models, and that's a little opaque. I couldn't follow that, and I wasn't familiar with them. But once you get past basically the introduction, I could follow it pretty well. It does help to have a basic understanding of machine learning. I mean, I've taken a class in machine learning. I have some programming experience in C++, Python, and R, if you want to consider that a programming language. And I do have like very, very minimal database understanding experience, but I am by no means a computer scientist. So I would say that reading this paper, you may have to look up about 6 or 7 words on Wikipedia once you could get past the introduction. But it's actually a pretty easy paper to read. It's only, I think it's 14 pages, but 4 of those pages are reference pages. So you have about 10 pages of actual paper, and it reads pretty well. So it's written in pretty easy language. So I'll include a link to the paper in the descriptions. I would suggest you read it. You can find plenty about the controversy, but I don't know how many people actually read the paper or know about the paper. And it brings up some big important issues, and it's actually pretty interesting. So check it out. Anyway, thank you.